This episode is generously sponsored by Yumiko. The holidays are right around the corner. Need a last-minute gift for your favorite dancer? A Yumiko gift card is the perfect way to get them exactly what they want. Visit the Yumiko website at yumiko.com to purchase now or visit their New York boutique. Then your loved one can customize the perfect leotard, tights, leggings, and much more. Stuff their stocking with the highest quality dancewear at yumiko.com.
I'm Rebecca King-Ferraro.
And I'm Michael Breeden, and you're listening to Conversations on Dance.
This week on Conversations on Dance, we are joined by the chief dance critic of the New York Times and one of our most frequent guests, Alastair Macaulay. Alastair, an expert on dance history, has previously guided us through histories of Balanchine's classic ballet Serenade and the work of Frederic Ashton. This week, he delves into the true history of one of ballet's most revered choreographers, Marius Petipa. We take a look at what works have been falsely attributed to Petipa, how he was perceived in his lifetime, and why his work still matters. This is our last episode of 2018, and we want to personally thank every listener that tuned in this year. We hope you have a wonderful holiday season and that you join us again in the new year.
So thank you for coming on the podcast again, Alastair. We were trying to think of how many we had done with you. It's like,
Do you know?
This is number 6.
No,
I thought we thought it was
yeah.
5. Maybe we'd done. So we have more. You're a fan favorite. So we're happy to have you back. And today we're going to be talking about why Petipa matters. And we're excited to talk to you about it. So let's kick it off.
So you have lectured on this topic at Harvard before, and you'll be presenting another lecture on December 26th at the New York Public Library. Just to get us started today, can you give our listeners a little background on Petipa and why, even if people may not recognize his name, they are familiar with his work?
Yeah, he's a great mystery man. Everybody is unconsciously familiar with Petipa in the ballet world. He's the man who put 32 fouettes into Swan Lake, for example. He's the one who choreographed the original Sleeping Beauty. He did the original party scene for the Nutcracker. He was too ill. He only got to work with Tchaikovsky in his 70s.
Uh-huh.
But he did Sleeping Beauty right the way through, fell ill during the Nutcracker, but the whole of the rest of the Nutcracker, Tchaikovsky had composed the score according to a plan that Petipa had drawn out. And he would say, I want 64 bars of this, I want 30 bars of this, I want it in this tempo. Tchaikovsky had already done Swan Lake in 1877 in a kind of version of the score that just doesn't work to this day theatrically. But Petipa and his colleagues knew how to turn it inside out and turn it basically into the Swan Lake that we now know.
Right.
Again, he fell ill and he only did half of Swan Lake.
Right.
And he also did Don Quixote, he did La Bayadère, he did most of what we now see in Le Corsaire, or much of it, Raimonda.
Right.
The bulk, and the editor, Giselle and Esmeralda, and the version of Coppelia we usually see. So that's huge.
Yeah.
He is, I think, much more than Balanchine. He is the choreographer whose work we see most today.
Interesting. What ballets are most commonly credited to Petipa that we and our listeners might be surprised to learn that he merely revised? You were just saying that he edited some items.
It's very interesting to go through Giselle to see which bits are by him. And we don't quite know. A lot of Act 2 he overhauled. But there's definitely in Giselle Act 1, the variation with the famous hops on point. That's his work. He added that, I think, in the 1880s. I might be wrong.
Okay.
And the last solo that Giselle does in Act 2, she comes in some versions, Albrecht's lying there at the front looking exhausted. She comes in sometimes with an armful of lilies and offers it to Myrtha, saying, please, please let him off. Don't make him dance to death. Myrtha, of course, being the bitchy queen of the willies, says, no. And Giselle then throws her energy into dancing. That solo that she does there is by Petipa, added again in the late 19th century. It's very hard to imagine Giselle without those bits.
Yeah.
So
and the Coppelia that we see is just about all his work.
Right.
As far as we can tell, I could get into pedantry as to why Cecchetti and Ivanov also may have contributed. It's complex.
So what are some examples of work that we credit to Petipa that may not be wholly his after all?
Well, the joke one is what I used to see before you people were born, as the Le Corsaire Pas de Deux. It was not, I think, known in the West, and then the Kirov brought it in 1961, and it made a sensation with ballerinas like Alla Sitsova and the great male dancer Yuri Solovyov. And then Nureyev did it with Margot Fonteyn, and it was the calling card of their career in the 60s. And it used to have longer ovations than the dances. So nobody had ever seen anything, because it was the ultimate vehicle for what Nureyev could do best as a male dancer. And amazingly, Fonteyn knew how to hold her own and get just as much applause.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And she was in her 40s. Well, that's always been attributed to Petipa. The Kirov then revised the whole of Corsair in, I think I saw production in 1989. Now it was revised as a pas de deux à trois, where there's an extra cavalier. It gets complicated. Then we found this century that actually none of that, pas de deux or pas de deux à trois, is by Petipa. It was added in 1915 after Petipa's death for Kasavina, and it was by a man called Samuel Andrianov. So there's that kind of thing that isn't by Petipa.
Right.
One of the other mysteries about him is that he was prosecuted successfully in his lifetime in 1862 for plagiarism
Hysterical.
by the senior choreographer Jules Perrault. Jules Perrault in Petipa's lifetime was a much bigger deal. He had worked with all the great ballerinas in London, Paris, Milan, and Russia.
Right.
And he'd been the main choreographer in St. Petersburg for about 10 years. He was revered. Petipa was his junior. Took a dance from Perrault's dances when he and his wife danced at the Paris Opera, or appeared at the Paris Opera, but credited it to himself rather than Perrault. Well, Perrault was on the scene, so he took Petipa to court and won.
Right. Interesting.
And we kind of have no evidence that actually Petipa did an original thing in his entire career. It's possible he came to Paris a lot. He liked to see what people were doing there, and it may be that all the ideas we think of as Petipa may be what he borrowed from others. And somebody else who was very well known was his brother. He was not the big Petipa. The big Petipa was his brother Lucien Petipa, who was the original Albrecht in Giselle, and then became a choreographer. And he worked with Verdi on ballet for the Four Seasons, and Wagner for Tannhäuser. The score that we now know in Namuna by Lalo, that was what Lucien Petipa did. He worked in Paris. Paris was the hub of ballet. As poor Marius, baby brother, was shunted off to the provinces. Nobody quite realized that Russian ballet was going to be the future.
Interesting. That's so fascinating.
Were people aware that Petipa was not maybe a true original in its time, and it's just as time has gone on, we've lost sight of that? Or what was the perception of Petipa in his time?
He probably was never as well paid as Perrault had been. I think the Russians treated him as a minor artist. But the thing was, he survived. And all of these other people like Perrault, Saint-Léon, his brother, they all died. He carried on into his 70s and his 80s. And there was a very enterprising man who ran the Mariinsky in the 1990s, the unpronounceable Prince Ivan Vsevolozhsky.
Wow.
And he wanted to jazz up ballet, and he said, we're not going to put up with minor composers anymore. Petipa had been working with Cesare Pugni, nobody's favorite, and then for 20 years with Ludwig Minkus. He's the man in Bayadère and Corsair and blah, blah, blah. Vsevolozhsky wasn't having this anymore. And he said, we're going to put you together with Tchaikovsky. And actually Petipa found it quite hard work, because Tchaikovsky was a very endearing man. They weren't typically Russian artists. They both got inspiration from the West, and they both believed in making art about art. Whereas the trend in Russia was Russian subject matter for Russian people, like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, the painter Ryapin. That was the kind of climate there. Petipa and Tchaikovsky were different. They got on that way. But rhythmically, Tchaikovsky was much more subtle than Petipa was equipped to deal with.
Right. So how did that partnership really work for them? What was their dynamic like back and forth?
Well, Petipa would set these amazing scenarios, which you can see, where it breaks the whole ballet down into this amazing, I think they call it a minutage, where every little item, the guests enter in Nutcracker at so many bars, this kind of tempo. Now, Tchaikovsky could deviate from that, but it gave him a framework.
Right.
And he probably seemed to consult with Petipa at every stage. And actually, he was the kind of composer who needed a framework. And really suited him. Even if he deviated, it gave him a focus, a structure.
Right.
Really, you can you can argue, and musicologists do, about Tchaikovsky's symphonies, about most of his operas. Only 2 of them are done a lot. But the 3 ballets, particularly the 2 he did with Petipa, are pretty flawless work. It just stimulated him. People always say to me, how can you stand seeing Nutcracker so often? And one thing is the music, because it just keeps changing every 2 minutes.
So
you don't
good.
get bored because it. Yeah. And then the more you listen, the more you realize there's every item in Nutcracker, the ones you think you know about. Just listen. There's so much going on in the orchestration. You can see why different choreographers all make different responses.
I loved your piece about. Sorry, I know this is off topic, but about flowers and Nutcracker.
Oh, thank you. It's a great pleasure to work on.
Yeah, if people haven't read it yet, they really should, because it was
And Adriana said she was like crying.
Yeah, it did make me like a little emotional. Yeah.
Well, that means we're getting. Of course, you're talking about the Balanchine Nutcracker, and those 2 choreographers, Petipa and Balanchine, are related.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
And indeed, Stravinsky too. Stravinsky, the great modernist of the early 20th century, he'd made Faber, Petrushka, Rite of Spring. He'd done most of Lénos, though it hadn't yet been published. Then in the 20s, after the First World War, he started to become more interested in neoclassicism. And he and Diaghilev, when they were stuck in Spain during and after the First World War, used to play the score of Sleeping Beauty as piano duets. And they loved this Tchaikovsky. They were thinking retro. They were thinking back to the Russia that they weren't ever expecting to see again. Well, you think that'd be enough. And Diaghilev then put on the production of Sleeping Beauty called The Sleeping Princess in London, 1921. But actually, when Stravinsky saw it, it was the choreography that overwhelmed him. He knew the music. What he had forgotten was what Petipa does to it, which isn't literally what Tchaikovsky is doing. It's in some ways much more architectural. And he just said, this is one of the revelations of my life. And he wrote in his autobiography in 1935, for me, this was the triumph of the Apollonian principle. Here I see the perfect example of order over chaos. So it's classicism from now on. And he said, this is the demonstration of the Apollonian principle. Well, that's 1921, 1928, Stravinsky makes Apollo. That's before he started to really know Balanchine, but of course the 2 men then click when they do work on Apollo.
Right.
Balanchine didn't make the premiere, but he knew Stravinsky when he was working on it. Balanchine loved what Petipa was doing. He just came up in this revolutionary period when the Russians in St. Petersburg were going through crisis in what was now called Petrograd, with no money around, and modernism was trying new things with legs going higher, bigger lifts and everything. But they had 1 or 2 ballet masters who would start to, like Fyodor Lopukov, say, forward to Petipa. And he'd make new ballets, but they were pure dance, taking the pure dance qualities from Petipa's ballets. That was the climate in which Balanchine came of age and started to choreograph.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah. Balanchine always credited Petipa. He said he took everything from Petipa, but do you think that's really...
Sometimes it's as if he thinks Petipa and God are the same person. He says, I take everything from Petipa. And then he also says, I don't create, God alone creates, I assemble. But sometimes the way he talks about Petipa and God becomes absolutely interchangeable, I think. I am the one, the arranger. They did it first.
Are there any specific moments that we can think of that he was really strongly influenced by Petipa, like a moment that's very iconic?
I'm not sure I'm answering you properly, but my mind jumps, say we're talking about the Nutcracker, because it's in repertory right now. And of course, most of the choreography is by Ivanov. But probably Ivanov was actually doing just what Petipa wanted. I don't think Ivanov in the Nutcracker was particularly original. Maybe in the Snowflakes. The original Sugar Plum Fairy did gargouillards. Balanchine, with a revisionist mind, says, I'll have gargouillards, but I won't give them to the Sugar Plum Fairy. I will instead give them to Marzipan.
Interesting.
I think if you look really carefully, there's an amazing figure that Ivanov gives to the Sugar Plum Fairy, where she, with her back to the audience, she does a high seconde, and then she peels down with a fouette down into supported croisé penché. Balanchine kind of does a variation on that also, at just the same point of the music. It's just he puts an extra bit of supported before she goes down into the penché.
Right. Interesting.
His mind is thinking along those things. It's just look how I can tweak.
That's so interesting about the gargouillade too, because that's such like a rare step that we don't see that often. It's so challenging.
The only time we really see gargoyles in 19th century ballet.
Yeah, I would think.
I think actually Ratmansky has discovered a few more.
Interesting.
If you look at his Sleeping Beauty, supporting characters have what you and I might call demi-gargoyles. It's just done with one foot and not with the other. But you get Ratmansky discussing with Doug Fullington, and they can tell you where a demi-gargoyle or a full gargoyle is notated in, I think, the complete Paquita, that kind of thing.
Right.
That's another Petipa ballet.
There you go. Yeah. Interesting. That's so cool. Let's talk a little bit about Ratmansky and some of the work that he's doing to kind of bring some life back into these Petipa ballets and do some research into the original.
It is phenomenal because, dance of all kinds has these notators, and they're normally species apart, but they aren't choreographers. Doug Fullington is a wonderful example of them. So bright, so industrious. Sometimes they're much more nerdish than Doug. But, and European companies depend on notators.
Right.
The Royal Ballet swears by them. Ratmansky is the first major choreographer who's gone and studied the choreography. He's began that, I think, around 2014, and he and his wife took almost a year off to steep themselves in how notation really works.
His wife, too. They did.
Yeah, no, they're great friends, and they look at it together, and I think, I don't know them, but as I've heard him talk about it to an audience, they kind of consult, and one of them will say, oh, look, I think we didn't pay attention to that little squiggle in the score, and they realize that little squiggle is a little bit of notation that means something else.
Right.
So even when his first big project was The Sleeping Beauty, he did it for American Ballet Theatre in 2015, but then they staged it at La Scala later that year, and I think during that they both suddenly thought, oh, look, there's that bit of notation. We must get that bit right.
Amazing.
I don't think they were very happy with the La Scala production. There were other complexities, but they realized they were getting deeper into the notation.
Right.
I think they've now made tweaks back at the American Ballet Theatre staging, which will come back to the Met in June. So that was the first one. Then Ratmansky went on to do Swan Lake, which he did in Zurich. And I think it's been announced on your podcast that Lourdes Lopez has booked it for Miami.
Well, she's hoping to, I think, right? Was that? Yeah. I think it was, yeah. If she said it, it's probably happening.
I mean, there are lots of small revelations in it. But a big one is there's fabulous, well-known music for the waltz in Act 1. That's Petipa. It's never been danced in the West because it needs a lot of dancers. When Sergeev staged it for what was then the Vic Wells Ballet, the Royal Ballet in 1934, he never staged a waltz.
Interesting.
So now we're seeing it for the first time. It's fabulous.
That's so cool. It's like taking a step back in time, but still so he's keeping it very relevant.
And it's a really good dance.
Yeah. What about the notation? There must have been evolution in it since that time and changing, or is it still really very much
I'm not I can't be the expert here. You'll have to get back Doug Fullington to get you more.
We need to get
it tells you lots on the lower body. It varies as to whether it tells you anything or much about the upper body.
Interesting.
For example, with the arabesques, the famous arabesques coming down the ramp in La Bayadère, the shades enter. Normally we see 24 of them. Actually, the notation has 48.
Whoa.
Coming down. I used to see 32 in the Royal Ballet production with the Nureyev. Staging just the shade scene. But the question is the line. And it does show not just how high the leg goes, which is about 90 degrees, but where the arm goes. Nowadays, of course, most people have the leg higher. And Ratmansky, I think, has got it back to 90 degrees. And I'm rushing, but Bayadère is another thing that he's tackled. He did it this year in Berlin in I think beginning of November. I was there. He staged a much rarer ballet, Harlequinade, which most of us ever know as Balanchine's Harlequinade, but there it is, the same score by Ricardo Drigo. I think it's an adorable score. And it turns out that there are a few bits where I think when the notation isn't very clear, Ratmansky goes to check what Balanchine puts on.
Oh, interesting.
But quite often he's either gone to the notation. There is one beautiful dance where he's had to work out really what he thinks Petipa would have done and come up with a fabulous solution. But a lot of invention.
I love that that's something. So Ratmansky's being so specific that something audience members might not think of, that he's restoring something like the height of the leg back to what the original.
Girls are happy.
Oh my God. Yeah, that sounds like heaven. I wonder if they'll find out about that for Giselle too, for those
With
hots.
arabesque, you can imagine they don't terribly want to go on doing a higher line 48 times as they come onto the stage or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely not.
If it was originally meant to be 48, then how did that work with the score?
Yeah, with the
were there
music.
just repeats, or did they just
You'll have to ask Doug Fullington. There's a lot of arabesques, so I wonder.
Maybe they just bigger steps out.
Must
Big
be.
steps, lady.
And maybe there's a repeat
they probably-
that's missing. That music will probably be done again and again.
That's probably what it is, yeah.
How interesting. I haven't thought that through. Doug Fullington, we need you to
So you mentioned the Corsair as an example of something that was credited to the Corsair pas de deux as something that was credited to Petipa, but that he did not do, and we didn't find out till much later. How did that even come about? That
there was this whole climate that Petipa became the brand name during his lifetime.
It still feels that way.
And sometimes he stamped it on, or it was stamped on ballets that were older than his. So we really cannot work out in Giselle what's his and which was done by older ballet masters.
Sure.
Then, because he was a busy man and individual ballerinas wanted their own versions of individual dances, he would sometimes say to Cicchetti or Legat, can you fix this one? And occasionally Legat would make a whole pas de deux or whatever. And he said it was better presented as Petipa's, even though Petipa hadn't made that number at all. Legat tells us this very happily, without any acrimony in his memoirs. He said, I made such and such to Rubinstein music, and it's known as Petipa. So it was a brand name. And then once Petipa died, they went on using the brand name. So it's convenient to say that the pas de deux in Corsair was by Petipa, not Andrianov, of whom not many of us have known.
Sure. Was there any effort after his death to preserve his work, kind of like a Balanchine Trust or Balanchine Foundation?
Yes, but it was during his lifetime they'd already begun to use this notation. It's the Stepanov notation. The most famous practitioner of it was this man called Nikolai Sergeev. Now, we hear different things of Nikolai Sergeev. He's another of the mystery men of ballet, but bless him, damn him, he left Russia at the time of the revolution with all the books of all the notation, and he brought them to the West. It's phenomenal. The Russians have tried suing for them in recent years, claiming they should have them back. It's like the Elgin marbles, which the British took from the Parthenon in Athens. They're saying, these are our treasures.
Wow.
Anyway, Sergeev took them. They can't be brought back, really, because other people paid for them after Sergeev's death.
Right.
And they're now in the Harvard Theatre Museum. And Harvard has been amazingly generous that they are, most of them, digitized, and you can just go free and have a look at them.
Wow.
Oh.
If you're good with just getting into a website, go treat yourself and look at the notation for the original Snowflakes by Ivanov in Nutcracker.
Amazing.
It's pictorial. It's so beautiful. You can see Ivanov was making all kinds of different crystal shapes to give the idea of snow, but with this big corps de ballet, sometimes multiple different crystals around the stage, as well as at one point they all go into a snowball.
Sure.
At the climax of the
We're
storm.
going to try to find that.
Yeah.
I'm
How
excited.
has anyone made efforts to reconstruct that dance?
I've been encouraging Doug Fullington to do that. Doug says that to do it properly, it needs, I think, about 50 people.
Wow.
He would love to
crazy.
put it on with the school,
Uh-huh.
but you'd have to have the right
how
school
cool.
with that.
Right.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's incredible.
I think Nicholas Sergeev, the great, he came to the West in the 20s, and he worked with Diaghilev Company on that 1921 Sleeping Beauty. Then Ninette de Valois cleverly got him at Sadler's Wells, so he staged Giselle there, Coppelia, Swan Lake, and Sleeping Beauty. And the Royal guarded them like crown jewels, made very few changes, and those really became the backbone of what we now know as the classics in the West because of Sergeev. He wasn't always happy with everything the Royal did with them, but it was normally to do with things like artificial swans, the things we regard as more peripheral.
Sure. So one of Petipa's contemporaries was Bournonville, and his works live on today and are often performed. So what do we think about the way that Petipa's works have lived on and how Bournonville's have lived on? Do we think that Bournonville's are a little bit closer to the original than Petipa's, or maybe vice versa?
we don't quite know, to be truthful. Bournonville's may also have been changed. When he died, he had a genius ballet master called Hans Beck, who actually sometimes took real liberties and moved things around. But all I can tell you is that Hans Beck and the people who then carried on after him kept the dance life of Bournonville alive. I just love looking at almost all the Bournonville that we can see, and it always just feels like dancing.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's a hard word literally to define what is dancing, but you kind of feel you know it when you see it. It seems such a simple thing. Look at quite a lot of companies, I'm afraid to say not least the Russians, doing Petipa, and you just think, well, it's academic, it's beautiful, and it's dead.
Right.
It's stony. Even the entrance of the shades in Bad Air isn't always the poem that it should be.
Right.
Seeing 6 fairies doing successive variations in Prologue of Sleeping Beauty should be so enchanting, and I've known it be enchanting. Right. Sometimes it's just pedantic.
Right. Yeah.
What are some elements of the Petipa style? In my head, it's so easy for me to, say a Balanchine style and know what that means, or even Ashton, or even Bournonville. But I think Petipa it's just a lot of people just use it as a label that's like anything that is classical ballet, anything 19th century. But what are some hallmarks of the Petipa style?
Well, as far as we can understand, comparing him, say, to Bournonville, at least by his work in the 1990s, 1890s, Sleeping Beauty, Raimonda, Swan Lake, he's making a much more extensive use of point work. He's using the block chu. All the latest bits and technique he is incorporating. So when double pirouettes came in because of those block chu, he's enjoying those. He's enjoying promenades on point, that kind of thing. Those things don't occur in Bournonville. He's loving the full stretched arabesque. So we so often see a fully extended fast arabesque in Petipa in the way that we don't so often in Bournonville. Bournonville loves attitude line. Petipa gives you the full stretch, and he loves the real miracle that we all recognize in ballet and that you see in Balanchine, which is a woman in particular, a man to a lesser degree, becomes a work of ideal geometry. She just steps into that attitude, that arabesque, and suddenly you think, oh, in a way, she's no longer a woman. She is an emblem of the divine. That happens, I think, in Petipa all the time.
That's amazing. You're just talking about, we're talking about the style or things that we notice. You're just talking to us like, that's just ballet.
Right.
That's just what we know.
I think it seems, I don't know that he was the first person to do it. He may have picked up from French choreographers we don't know about. But from the history that we can see on stage, he does it in a way that Bournonville does not.
Interesting.
Bournonville is so dancey, but he doesn't give us the full
thing,
grand glory. He also has huge resources, so he can have big corps de ballet in the way that Bournonville did not.
Right.
He also goes for the other big essence of ballet, which is its sexism, which I wish I could do this on video, but but the image that even if you don't know about ballet, you know about, is a man holding out his hand and the woman saying, why, thank you. And she takes the hand and steps onto point and instantly holds a great attitude. And that way that her body becomes transformed with the man's support, on the way she then does supportive pirouettes. Basically, she is there on point. He may never go on point. He is there to partner. She may not return the compliment. She can never. That sexism, Petipa didn't invent it, but he really crystallized it in a way that we see it going on, particularly with Balanchine. Almost every other choreographer is rather shy of it. But those two, Petipa and Balanchine, really give us now maybe a very beautiful, glorious, thrilling kind of sexism. We can say it advantages the woman, but it's certainly not equality.
Right. Yeah. What do you feel is Petipa's biggest triumph?
Well, the perfect ballet, and it's great to see as full dance theatre if you see it in the production with good resources, is Sleeping Beauty. It's not least Tchaikovsky's score. It's such a poem, and it just is doing something different at every few seconds. That's so great. And Petipa, even if he didn't fully grasp Tchaikovsky's music, his just, particularly with all those women variations, his just thinking poetically different things all the time.
Right.
Something else he goes, I think, beyond Balanchine is his sense of the geometry of the stage. When he gives him a major ballerina variation and he gives each woman a different map of the stage. You're going to begin going down this vertical, then you're going to take that diagonal. And at the end of each variation, she's really given us a different atlas of the stage. And you can see he's thinking of the whole stage in a way that I think even Balanchine and Ashton never quite do. He's mapping it out. You are the mistress of this space.
Interesting.
And you've got a big ballerina variation like the two ones Aurora does, Act 1 with the violin and Act 3 with the violin. She's mapping out the space. And spacious, she's just saying, I am the prima. And with each of those lines, with the straight line, the horizontal, the zigzag, the diagonal, she does a different phrase of steps. All fitted to the music.
Interesting.
People can get so defensive and feel that, certainly I know that people that had been raised, trained classically, and had specific ideas about the full lengths we did in, say, Miami City Ballet.
Right. Exactly.
This is, quote, wrong. This needs to be this way or that way. A lot of what we perceive to be as maybe original because it is iconic today, what is not actually original. Like you brought up, you had that great talk about Black Swan Padada. How, it's become this huge thing, and anyone, if you were to take it out of the ballet or change it, revert back to the original, or have the ballerina in a scarlet tutu, as has been done, people who think themselves to be purists might riot.
Right.
But so now we're seeing these revivals that are happening more frequently, and their history. But what are some components of the revivals that surprised even you? Things that you maybe had presumed were original but are not in these.
Well, in a way, the most fascinating was Ratmansky's first, because he did Sleeping Beauty, and it was full of points of style in footwork and leg work where you thought, oh. Now, some of that you could have predicted. Legs, he was pretty fastidious, did not go higher than 90 degrees. He's loosened up on that with Harlequinade and maybe Swan Lake. The legs sometimes do go higher, and he isn't quite so determined about male dancing. Some of that looks more like modern male dancing. Right. But in Sleeping Beauty, he not only would not let the legs go too high, he also often had women just dancing on half point. So distinguished between half point and full point.
Interesting.
Various times. He had women sometimes spotting to the front, which we thought was a Balanchine method.
Yeah.
Sometimes spotting, I think, to the side, sometimes in the direction of the turn. So there's a whole different set of choices, and he says it's all in the notation he thinks. And he also, Ratmansky has so many other sources, so he knows teachers who knew old teachers who knew about spotting techniques.
Right.
And certainly it's pre-Balanchine things like spotting to the front. He can't prove that Petipa was using that, but it probably goes back to at least 1910 and maybe further.
Amazing.
I was surprised by the demi-point work too. I remember thinking, seeing the they do chaînés on demi-point. I think Florine does, right?
Yes.
And of course, we think of that as a Balanchine thing.
Of course, you think of chaînés and demi and Snow. I think the female principal in Rubies does it.
There's quite a few core moments where,
The Princess Florine does it, and I think some of the prologue fairies too. So that's Petipa. It probably was standard at that time. It wasn't just Petipa.
Right.
Doing all those things on point was a later development. But interesting, Ratmansky brings it back, and it does change the texture. And with basically the Sleeping Beauty we're used to seeing in every other production is too slow. Ratmansky gets back the right tempo, and curious of the fit of the footwork to the faster tempo, you just think this is right. It's just falling into place.
Amazing.
So many things. Retires aren't nearly so high, but you can do fast retires if you're just going to calf.
Right. That's true. So just to wrap it up, unless we have anything else we really want to add, but I just want to know why you think Petipa had such an impact on ballet, and why are we still here talking about him today?
Well, when you think of some of the scores that he used before Tchaikovsky's, some of them are disappointing. I get tired of a lot of Baudelaire, and that's better than Don Quixote and Corsair, I think. And yet, even there, those shades come down the ramp in Baudelaire, and you just know you are watching an absolute master architect. And he's so daring that he'll give you the same arabesque with one girl, then another, then another, then another. I'm used to seeing either 24 or 32.
Sure.
How amazing there was more than that.
Yeah.
Just doing the same step, and the audience can never have enough of it.
Yeah.
Right.
It's the most weirdly satisfying thing.
It's true. Yeah.
Just about everything in that core dance that they then do, it begins two-dimensionally with the arabesque and then that beautiful stretch back and the bras. Tick, tock, all of them doing the same step. Then they become three-dimensional when they're all stretched across the stage in vertical rows. None of those steps are virtuoso. To do all of them the same way is so exposed, though. So it becomes an exercise in high style and just very beautiful. It's a poem. And when you watch a Petipa variation for a woman, like nobody now, except almost like minimalists, he'll give you the same step 16 times. And if it's the way I used to see ballerinas, the way you would see Aurora do petit développé in the Act 3 variation, forwards on a diagonal and letting the arms gradually build and then the head and the eyes and everything start to swim. It becomes a crescendo, and it's one of the greatest knockout moments in ballet with a great ballerina. Where I think of, say, Mel Part, Lindsay Moore for me above all, Beryosova demonstrating it, Leslie Collier, Svetlana Beryosova, Margot Fontaine on film. Each of them does a different poem at that moment. But with each one, you just know that the house is in love with her, and that curiosity doing the same step 16 times on a diagonal forwards is the climax of the whole of Sleeping Beauty.
Like mesmerizing.
Phenomenal.
Yeah. I mean, it's
Partly because he trusts the ballerina. Petipa gives you the structure, and the ballerina then can work out what she can do with her upper body to make it her.
Yeah.
Is there a Petipa revival that you would like to see most? And actually, it can be something that maybe can't be revived too.
Yeah.
Well, something you can see on YouTube, but I've never really looked, is Raimonda. Now, Ratmansky hasn't got to that yet, but a man who died last year, Sergei Vikarev, who began this whole process of reconstructing, he looked at the notation at Harvard, but he also had all access to the Kirov-Mariinsky resources. He staged it not in St. Petersburg, but he staged it at La Scala. And he did it with the real old original costumes, which are dated, shall we say. But you can go on YouTube. I think the cast is with Novikova doing Raimonda. It's just very interesting. I would love to see what Ratmansky was so much more command of style. Raimonda is, in a way, the ultimate Petipa ballerina work. It's made for Pierina Legnani, who's always famous as the woman who introduced the notorious 32 fouettes. And people speak about it as if that's all she could do. No, she had a famous back, very expressive, and she had famous bourrées. They were the first bourrées compared to strings of pearls, which later on became the standard way to describe bourrées.
Sure.
It started with her. You look at that incredible hand clap variation in Raimonda, where we see Act 3 was Cortège Hongrois or Paradis, Balanchine's Take It Raw. She claps her hands, and then she does bourrées, pauses at the end of a phrase, and then does more bourrées. That's all that happens. Petipa just trusts the magic of bourrées. Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much
Thank
for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Always the best. Thank you for joining us this week. We are excited to announce that you can now listen to Conversations on Dance on Spotify, in addition to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or through our website at conversationsondancepod.com. Subscribe now to receive notifications of new episodes. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Conversations on Dance. See you next week.